I am Tom Steyer. And our goal today is to frame the discussion about the Monterey Shale. There has been a lot of passion expended on this topic, and I think what we're trying to do today is take a step back and consider the evidence as dispassionately as we can. Our goal today is not to rush to judgment, but to establish a common set of facts before we really discuss what we're supposed to do about them. And the fact set should include both what we know and what we don't know. As an investor, Kate was referring to the fact that I spent 30 years as a professional investor. You get very used to working in uncertainty and incomplete information, but it is always important to know what you don't know. And once you've got that laid out about where you stand, what you can be sure of, what you can't be sure of, you can set up a reasonable risk-reward framework and talk about the positives and negatives of pursuing any course of action. That's what we're here today to do. Now, I know we've been told that there's a gigantic oil boom on the immediate horizon. I've looked at the projections of jobs, economic growth, taxes to the state, and the initial projections were absolutely gigantic. I'm not even going to reference them, however, because if there's one thing I've learned about numbers is, once you mention them, they're in your head. And if someone says, here are the reasons you shouldn't take them seriously, the only thing you remember is the number. It's kind of like, giving someone their grades and then their, how they did in the class. They never hear how they did in the class. All they hear is the grade, and that's the only thing they walk away remembering. But the one thing I will say is this. Of course, we're interested in jobs and growth. But we're interested in actual jobs that we believe in and actual growth that we can believe in. So when we look at the claims, we're going to ask ourselves, how much is really in place? Is it economically recoverable? And we're going to look at the risks, and we're going to say, where is it? Let's establish that. Is it safe to extract it? Will it affect farming and water in the relevant areas? And how does it affect our climate goals? We know we want a vibrant economy. We know we want high-quality jobs. There's nobody in the state of California who doesn't care about those things. But I think it's important to look at the experience to date. This is not the first year that we're talking about going after oil in the state of California. We need to look at actual production data to see what's really credible. So one thing is we know we need to look at the facts. Two, we know we're not North Dakota. They don't produce $45 billion a year worth of fruits and vegetables. They don't have our kind of seismic activity. And none of their shale is under Los Angeles. So when we think about this, I think we should think about it as Californians with our geology, with our economy, and with our people. And once we've got the facts laid out, let's take a deep breath, and we can start to draw conclusions and create strategies. So that's what we're here today to do. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Tom. Grab that from you. All right, you guys gonna talk from your chairs?
Yes.
So I know. All right, great. So I am very thrilled to have a chance to introduce our two panelists. What we're going to do is have them each talk briefly about work they've done in this area that really does exactly what Tom just laid out, which is put out the facts, present the reality from existing data, from existing economic analysis of what this may look like if we do it in California, and then we'll have a conversation among this group about those presentations. And first, we have Dr. David Hughes, who is a geoscientist. And a real science guy. You worked for what, 30 years for the Geological Survey of Canada, I think that's right. Doing scientific science and research, and a lot of work on sort of underground resources. A lot of work on coal in particular. Really somebody who understands, and you don't find a lot of these I have to say in the environmental movement, a lot of people who really understand resources and resource economics. And so very excited to have Dr. Hughes here to talk about a study that just came out that you saw coming in, I'm sure, from Post-Carbon Institute, and I know I always get the name wrong, so somebody help me. Physicians, engineers, scientists for
healthy energy.
Healthy energy, great. PSE, okay, good. That's easier. I knew it was physicians, scientists, and engineers, a great group of people to have on your side in any debate. And then to my right, Rob Collier worked, we were really lucky to have Rob work with us at Next Generation. We commissioned from him, and he did an investigative series on the Monterey Shale with Next Generation that really kind of lays the facts out. We had become concerned that the debate had really become polarized between stop everything and do everything. And so trying to get some of the facts out about what's really potentially happening with the Monterey Shale is a great overview, and in particular goes into some of the economics, the job projections, and projections of an economic boom for California. So Rob will be looking at that. Rob was, many of you know, I'm sure, the San Francisco Chronicle for a long time, so his byline should be familiar to many of you. So with that, I'm going to let Dave take it away. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kate. Will the Monterey Shale be an energy and economic boon for California? There's a lot of conventional wisdom. How do I get this rolling here?
Here we go. That's the next one.
Oh, okay. That's simple. The advent of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling pretty much within the last decade has really created a new paradigm in terms of developing previously undevelopable oil and gas resources. There's a huge amount of enthusiasm for what's called the shale revolution, talk of energy independence, Saudi Arabia. The assumption being that shale oil, which is really tight oil, oil from tight formations, will allow the U.S. to become the largest oil producer in the world. A report that came out a couple years ago suggested that the Monterey Shale of California contains 2/3 of U.S. tight oil resources, 15.4 billion barrels. And another report that came out, I guess, early in 2013, that the development of the Monterey Shale would be a bonanza producing billions in tax revenue and millions of jobs by 2020. And this created a big stir. These are the two reports. The EIA Intech report on the left was published in July of 2011. Intech is a consulting company that was commissioned by the EIA, but the EIA published the report. The report on the right is a report on the economics of the Monterey Shale based on the EIA Intech report published in March of 2013, and also created a big stir. If we look at the numbers in the EIA Intech report, total U.S. tight oil resources, you see the Monterey is a huge chunk of it, 15.4 billion barrels, 64% of the total. The Eagle Ford and the Bakken Formation, which many of you have probably heard about, those are two tight oil plays that really work. The Bakken in North Dakota, the Eagle Ford in Texas, are really small slivers of this pie by comparison to the Monterey Shale. If we look at actual production of tight oil in the U.S., you can see the Bakken and the Eagle Ford produce about 69% of all tight oil, yet they're considered to be relatively small in terms of tight oil resources. If you look at the right bar, you can see a little red cake on top of it. That's the production from what we might consider tight oil from the Monterey Shale. So the Monterey Shale, in terms of production, is absolutely dwarfed by true tight oil plays. But in terms of resources or purported resources, it's very large. If we compare the Monterey numbers that were published in the EIA Intech report by comparison to the Bakken, we can see that the Monterey supposedly covered 1,700 square miles. The Bakken covers nearly 20,000, so the Bakken is about 10 times as big an area. The report assumed that 16 wells could be drilled per square mile over those 1,700 square miles in the Monterey compared to 2.4 in the Bakken. The report assumed that every well in the Monterey would recover 550,000 barrels of oil, which is roughly triple the assumption for the Bakken. And ultimately, the resource numbers are far larger for the Monterey than the Bakken. So if we look at this is a critical figure that was in the EIA Intech report, those Two circles show the area with potential. The orange is Oxy petroleum leases. The report assumed that 80% of potential underlie Oxy petroleum leases. Most of the potential is in the San Joaquin Basin, some of it possibly in the Santa Maria Basin and in the Ventura Basin further south, but most of it in the San Joaquin. If we look, what we did is we looked at the Monterey. There's a lot of conventional production from what's called the diatomite in the Monterey. We didn't want to look at that. We wanted to look at possible analogs to the Bakken Shale, tight source rocks where the oil is more or less in place. It hasn't migrated. And that's what really makes the Bakken Shale work. So all of these red wells are wells that we looked at. Those are shale members of the Monterey Formation. And these yellow outlined areas are a couple of the major fields that we looked at, the Elk Hills, the Rose and North Shafter fields, which are theoretically analogs. If we look at some cross sections through the San Joaquin Basin, we can see, first of all, that the Monterey is very variable. It's folded. It's an area of high tectonic activity. It can go from near surface to a depth of 20,000 feet over a distance of 20 or 30 miles. The Bakken, by contrast, is very widespread, relatively undeformed, and quite thin by comparison to the Monterey. If we look at these colored areas down at the bottom, those are areas that are in what's called the oil window, the temperature and pressure regime where oil is actively being generated today. These major fields over top, a lot of the oil in those huge fields in the San Joaquin Basin were sourced from Monterey Shale. So the oil was formed in the Monterey and it migrated up dip to fields like the Shafter field and up section to some of these very big fields like the Lost Hills field. The point being, a lot of that oil is migrated. It's traveled tens of miles to where it finally was collected. So it's not like the Bakken where the source rocks are in place and the oil really hasn't migrated. We looked at production from all of those shales, and we can see that there is quite a bit of production historically. Our assumption was after the Intech report came out talking about 15 billion barrels of oil, the oil industry would basically drop everything and try to apply modern fracking techniques to begin to recover that oil. So we wanted to look at all of the recent drilling to see what the characteristics of those wells were in terms of productivity and in terms of production. So you can see that production overall in these shale formations is going up, but it's still a tiny sliver of tight oil production in the U.S. A very key assumption in the Intech report was this graphic here. This is the decline profile of what Oxy called tight shale wells. So they had an Elk Hills area shale vertical well, which they said would have an initial production when you first drill it and connect it of 800 barrels per day. The average horizontal well would have an initial production of 500 barrels per day, and the average vertical well, 200 barrels per day. Remember, they said every well will recover 550,000 barrels of oil. And the initial productivity of a well is a pretty good indication of how much oil that well is going to recover over its lifetime. So what we did is we looked at every well drilled since mid-2013, and we looked at the initial productivity of all of those wells and compared them to the assumptions in the Intech report. And what we found is that no well drilled in the last decade even came close to the average typical Elk Hills shale well. Only a few horizontal wells actually exceeded that IP, but on average, they were only about 40% of it. And the vertical wells were even worse, just over 50% of what the assumption in that report what those assumptions were. So our conclusion from that is those assumptions are grossly overstated. Referring to the USC study, the economic study that Rob is going to talk about more in depth, I just wanted to point this out. These are the oil production assumptions in that report by 2030. They had several assumptions, but the highest one was the Monterey Shale was going to increase California oil production by a factor of 7. The mean estimate was it would increase by 136%, so more than double by 2020. That's only 6 years out. And I would suggest those are wildly overstated assumptions. So key takeaways, the Monterey Shale is not an analog to tight oil plays like the Bakken and the Eagle Ford. The EIA Intech report is extremely optimistic in its 15.4 billion barrel estimate of technically recoverable oil from the Monterey Shale. The Monterey Shale will certainly produce more oil and gas, but likely only a very small fraction of what's been reported in the Intech report. The USC study's economic projections of Monterey tight oil are highly unlikely to be realized. So I'll leave it there for Rob.
Great. That I think we're all up in Sacramento. We're also used to people in other states saying, "But we're not California. You can't tell us to do." And I think one of the key takeaways here is we're not North Dakota. So that's certainly what I got from this report. And we'll dig in a little more during Q&A about some of those projections and how the oil industry does those projections and what they mean. But I'm going to turn it over to Rob now to dig in a little more on the economic boom job projections we've been seeing and the USC report, which I wasn't going to mention, but I will. We just heard was the focus of gubernatorial hopeful Neil Kashkari's energy plan depends on the Monterey Shale being developed. So he was just down in Kern County yesterday talking about this report. So it's a good moment to think about what it says. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kate. As Dave has so thoroughly explained, the California oil industry has hyped the production possibility of the Monterey Shale, but they've also hyped the economic impact, saying millions of jobs, tens of billions of dollars in new income, an epic boom that would transform the state's economy. In my brief remarks, I'm going to explain how it's been hyped, why the claims don't line up with the known facts, and what the state's most authoritative economic experts say. Now, even if you don't believe a single word that Dave said, and you still hold out hope that there is a possibility for a major oil boom in the Monterey Shale, even in that very unlikely event, the macroeconomic impact on the state would be disproportionately modest. And that, I think, is the main takeaway from the dissection that I've been able to do and other economists around the state have been able to do of this USC report and other reports about the Monterey Shale. So as we all know, the oil industry has long been an economic driver of the state. It still is in the parts of the central and southern areas, and throughout the southern San Joaquin Valley and the LA, Santa Maria, Ventura areas. There now, of course, is a lot of controversy about fracking, other drilling techniques. It's a growing topic because it has some economic impact. Historically, part of Hollywood was financed with oil money. Parts of Southern California real estate empires were started with oil money. Part of big ag was starting with oil money. So California is still the nation's fourth largest oil producer. It still has roots in the state's economy. But the state's oil production has been going gradually down. It's dropped by more than half in the past 20 years, while Texas and North Dakota have rapidly increased. So the hopes for the Monterey Shale come in the context of a gradual decline, and the hopes that California will echo the big boom of North Dakota and Texas and other shale deposits elsewhere in the United States. Now, as Dave mentioned, the central role in this campaign of boosting the economic projections of the Monterey Shale have been played by the University of Southern California report that was funded by the Western States Petroleum Association. It was issued last March. It came out with really amazing projections of 2.8 million, an average in their various projections of 2.8 million net new jobs, as many as 4.4 million in their most optimistic scenario, 14% increase in per capita GDP, $24 billion in state and local tax revenues, a new boom. It would be an epic, truly historic step for the state if these projections were to be true. Nobody could deny. The numbers were, that study was repeated again and again and again by WSPA, the Western States Petroleum Association, and echoed by politicians of both parties. Governor Jerry Brown, legislators on both sides of the aisle. There was remarkably very little analysis, however, of that study. The people read, as they often do, as we all do, you read the executive summary and you take it away, and that's as far as you go. There had been no dissection of these truly remarkable historic claims by the state's premier economic forecasters. An interesting fact that I noticed when I looked at the USC study itself was that the authors team did not include anyone with significant experience in oil industry economics or in industrial sector economic forecasting. It did include academics with experience in geophysics, oil engineering, urban economics, and non-academic communications experts. The chief author, Peter Gordon, who is a noted conservative pundit about how smart growth policies are bunk, has not done any economic projecting work. So at Next Generation, we decided, this deserves a closer look, and it deserves to be taken to the state's main economic experts for economic forecasting. Well, lo and behold, we went to them. These are people who are by no means ideologues. These are nonpartisan, apolitical. Jerry Nicholsburg, probably the most oft-quoted expert in the state on economic forecasting. Jesse Rothstein at UC Berkeley Goldman School of Public Policy, and Olivier Deschênes of UC Santa Barbara. They all took a close look at the USC report, dissected the methodology, or tried to, and came up empty-handed. They said, we cannot see any justification for these incredible numbers. They seem too big to be believable. Olivier Deschênes of UC Santa Barbara, who's a specialist in econometrics and labor markets, said, quote, I did not understand the methodology for the employment impacts, and he said he looked specifically at the Chapter 3 of the USC report, which is the real meat economic, serious analysis of where they generated the projections. He said, I spent 2 hours reading Chapter 3, and I continue to have a hard time understanding how the numbers in the tables are computed. Now, we can't use the term academic fraud because that is a term that requires an academic jury to determine, but the state's premier forecasters said that the USC report did not line up. Take a look at the employment data, the current employment data. Now, this is U.S. Census data quoted by a 2011 report by a consultancy named Pervin and Gertz that was contracted by WISPA. It shows, as you'll see, total direct employment of the oil and gas industry is 94,000. Now, that includes refineries and it includes gas stations. Now, neither refineries nor gas stations would increase in an oil and gas boom because they're not going to sell more gasoline to state drivers just because the petroleum is locally produced. Nor are the state's refineries going to be producing more oil to simply substitute foreign supplied oil, foreign sources of oil. So if you look at the total upstream and midstream direct employment of in the state's oil and gas industry is about 21,000, the top two numbers, the 18 and the 2. Standard multipliers for indirect employment range from 2 to 5 depending on the sector. The economists with whom we consulted said that 21,000 could multiply to a maximum of about 100,000 total employment for the upstream and midstream sectors, which are the sectors that would be affected by any potential boom in the Monterey Shale. So 100,000 total direct and indirect employment is what could be affected by any potential boom. Again, even if you don't believe a single word that Dave Hughes says, and even if you do believe that there is a possible production boom in the Monterey Shale, the basic numbers you're working from are 100,000 employment. Now, how do you get from there to 2.8 million new jobs, or in the maximum 4.4 million new jobs? This is the fundamental dilemma that the economists with whom we consulted wrestled, and the fundamental disconnect that they said could not be explained by the numbers. It turns out there are other studies that have been not publicized by WISPA. CSU Fresno, researchers there were paid by WISPA to do a study, and they came out with numbers that were remarkably lower. Remarkably, those findings were not publicized half as broadly or widely or loudly by WISPA itself. IHS CIRA, which is probably the most prestigious oil industry consulting firm in the United States, also did a study, it turns out, in December of 2012, which got, it turns out, 0 publicity. That's not a figure of speech. I mean, literally 0. If you look up Nexus and Google, there are no mentions of the study. It's on their website. Go look at it. It projects 0 net new jobs from the Monterey Shale by 2025. 0. And these are people who, again, cannot be accused of being activists. Actually, they could be accused of being pro-industry because they are consultants for the industry. Daniel Yergin, their head, is a very Pulitzer Prize winning, very well-known pundit on oil issues. So this is all, of course, a political issue. It is economics, but it's also politics. And in the state, last year and this year, oil, of course, has been a big issue of debate. The SB 4 was passed into law by the governor, signed by the governor last year, and there's a lot more legislation that's being fought over this year in the legislature about what to do with the state's oil industry. But the potential, the hype has not died. The dream has not died. So you have now on the campaign trail, it started up. As Kate mentioned, Neil Kashkari is hyping the Monterey Shale's production just yesterday down in Shafter in Kern County. And as we go forward, I think we can expect the whole issue of employment and macroeconomic impact in the Monterey Shale to become yet part of the hoary job killer argument, which is really the nuclear option in state politics. And it has been used to dramatic effect against many regulatory attempts to rein in industry or to impose environmental and public health restrictions on industry. with the state's oil industry, you have these wild projections of millions of dollars, millions of jobs, billions, tens of billions of dollars in income. But what will happen if the job killer argument is not relevant? What are the implications then if these USC projections are in fact not valid, are not backed up by the facts? Well, there's two fundamental takeaways. One is that the policymakers can be free to evaluate potential environmental and tax policies on their own merits. And California can continue to be the nation's laboratory for regulatory best practices. Now, one quick caveat, that does not necessarily mean that any regulatory effort that seeks to shut down a large portion of the state's oil and gas industry would have no impact. That is not necessarily the case. Any policies that seek to shut down existing employment, existing economic activity, could have a real impact, and that would have to be evaluated on its own. But looking forward at potential economic impact, a potential boom of future increased production, that is where state policymakers can indeed draw a lot of certainty that any new regulations or tax policies will not have any catastrophic impact. So you can move forward, policymakers, in developing best practices, and you don't have to look over your shoulders. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. That was great. Thank you. I don't think this is working, so I'm going to just keep talking loud. I wanted to give Tom a chance to respond to those presentations for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a little bit of a table discussion and then open it up. So, Tom, you have any wise words after hearing those two?
Probably not, but I have some words.
I just can't get it to work. So, can you just move that one over?
Okay. First of all, I wanted to say thanks to Dave and to Rob for both laying out the facts as we know them in the ground and also describing fairly the implications. I think that they've done us all a service. This is an attempt here to have a dragnet moment, just the facts, ma'am. But I think we should all take the deep breath we promised and sit here and try and figure out what it is we've heard and put it into a little context, because this is not the only dispute in the fossil fuel world that's been going on, including ones that people in this room have been involved in. So that, for instance, in the argument over the Keystone XL pipeline, the original oil industry projection was 250,000 jobs. And there really was no other side. I mean, they basically said this is going to create 250,000 jobs, and if you turn it down, you're basically, that's what you're turning down. In the final analysis, they got down to 3,500 construction jobs for 2 years and 35 jobs to let the pipeline continue. So when we think about this, this is not, it doesn't seem entirely out of character to find out that the expectations can be really inflated up front with promises that are extremely enticing and extremely exciting, but may not be completely borne out by the most thorough analysis. I mean, the one thing that seems clear from listening to these two guys is that the projections about recoverable oil and the projections about the creation of jobs from recovering that oil are both, at best, highly speculative. I mean, what they said was you can't recreate the methodology, and you certainly can't recreate the outcomes in any way that seems based on the facts on the ground. And in fact, when you listen to what the IHS CIRA report came up with, which is a highly respected, you really have to do what I said in the beginning, which is if someone gives you your grade in a course and then gives you your evaluation, actually having other numbers around is important, because otherwise you think, well, you give too much credibility to any number, even if it's been, in effect, the process has been debunked. So I think that the one thing we should make sure of today is that the optimistic numbers from these initial studies are not the baseline. They absolutely are not. They're just like the 250,000 jobs from the Keystone XL pipeline. We should just take those numbers and forget them. And we should try and look really hard at the facts and either have somebody explain those numbers or forget that they ever happened. And I think the other thing that we need to know is the golden state of California is not North Dakota, as Kate said. We're geologically different. If you ever looked at those strata in North Dakota versus here, they look really, really different because we have so much more seismic activity. We also have a completely different state of development in the state of California than they do there where their fields are. And so the risks of making a mistake here are wildly different than they are in North Dakota. I have only two more points. One is, don't forget, we are the world leader in controlling greenhouse gases. We have the most forward-thinking energy and climate laws in the world of any major economy. We have, AB 32 is in place. It is working, and we should, whatever else we do, let's remember that and remember we're committed to our climate, attitude. And the last thing I'll say is this. We should look, no one has talked about this because they love to look at these projects in a vacuum. But the fact is, the clean tech jobs are already disproportionately centered in the state of California because we have the venture capital money disproportionately here. We have the best laws in the United States and the world. And we have a climate where you can take advantage of things like solar. So this is the global hub for innovation. This is the biggest market for solar photovoltaic applications and for energy efficiency. We're 80% of US geothermal, and we right now, as of 2012, had over 400,000 clean tech goods and services jobs, and we added 15,000 new jobs in 2013. So put those numbers in contrast to the oil numbers, which were somewhere around 21,000 extraction jobs. If everything is right, and it really turned out there was all that oil in the ground, we'd be talking an upside of 100,000 total jobs we could create, and those are numbers that are fantasy. So when we sit here and talk about jobs, let's remember that the clean energy jobs are much more likely to solve our employment problems. We don't have, when we talk about taxes, we don't have the tax regime in terms of oil lifting that a lot of people think, including me, we should have. So we have a completely different risk reward. I think we're all in favor of substantial economic growth for the people of California. But we have if we want a boom in energy production, we have a boom in energy production. I think it's pretty clear our future is in the advanced energy economy, not in the fossil fuel economy. So we shouldn't ignore it. But let's remember where the real jobs are today and where the future jobs are going to be as we go forward. That's what I would say about this.
Thank you, Tom. Great response. Let me just move this over since I don't have a mic. Sorry, I'll move it back and forth. Thank you, Tom. That's great and a good context for this sort of, I don't know if all of you saw this, but Amy Harder, who was at the National Journal, did a great piece on the two faces of California, the growth in clean tech and the existing oil economy. And Tom just really highlighted those two sides of California, and this is a place where they come together. Rob, I wanted to start with you and just kind of dig in on those job numbers a little bit. I mean, many of you know that I was a big part of the green jobs movement, and not even we in our wildest dreams ever thought of 2.8 million jobs in California. So how did they get to that? And also, I think people probably want to know how IHS Sierra got to zero. So what's going on there? Sort of what does the analysis look like, and how are they doing that analysis? Does that work now? Maybe it does.
I think it does, yeah. Well, as I said, the methodology is totally untransparent. That's not me talking, that's people who are the state's expert on econometrics and economic forecasting. So how they got the numbers is totally unclear. As far as the IHS Sierra report, they project zero growth in unconventional oil in California. unconventional, meaning shale and shale-like formations in the Monterey Shale.
So they essentially take sort of some of the same approach Dave is taking here and
Exactly.
say, this isn't recoverable,
Exactly.
therefore no jobs.
Exactly.
Is that right? Okay. That makes sense. And kind of building on that point, and I'm sorry about the feedback, I think we're trying to fix that. Building on that point to you, Dave, talk for a second, and actually, Tom, you may be able to weigh in on this too, from your sort of investor days. How, we have this study that's looking at potential resources. It doesn't seem totally crazy that they took an existing set of data from somewhere to say this might be possible with these new technologies that are being used over here. And your points about the geology being different are critical. But I mean, is anyone from the oil industry going back and recalculating this? Are they, are you seeing signs that those numbers are being downgraded, that there's sort of an official reassessment of the Monterey Shale based on what the actual production data that you're looking at?
Depends on the company. I think I mentioned that 80% of the potential was thought to be under Oxy petroleum leases in that Intech report. I believe it was Chevron that looked at the same data and decided that they really weren't interested. They thought, like me, that rather than being source rocks in place or source rocks that were uplifted that still had the oil contained within them, that oil had migrated. The high degree of tectonism in California has really fractured that shale down to the micro level. And so there are conduits to allow that oil to move. And even if you look at fields like North Shafter, the North Shafter field was used as an analog in the USC economic study. The U.S. Geological Survey felt that oil had migrated 15 miles. So it's not an analog at all. So companies like Chevron would beg to differ.
Yep. And yeah, Tom, go ahead. Can you grab him the mic?
I'd like to make another point, which is I think Dave alluded to, but it's this. It's not like fracking is that new. And it's not like acidization is that new. These techniques have been around, including in California, for a long time. So if there were 15.4 billion barrels of extremely profitable oil and gas to be had at the drop of a hat in California, I think we'd be seeing a lot of frenzied activity by people who wanted to drop that hat. So when you think, one of the things that's going on here is there are some studies that don't seem particularly credible, making some gross claims, but it's kind of, the dog is not barking in many ways in the old Sherlock Holmes analogy. Where is the dog barking? When the dog doesn't bark, you should draw some conclusions from that.
That's a great point.
It's worth noting that Oxy's recently split its corporate structure and has split its California operations off into a separate entity and is moving its overall corporate headquarters to Texas. So that seems to mean most analysts have suggested that the writing is on the wall.
Tom, if you were, just to build on your point, I think that's a good indicator of this, but if you were kind of out there thinking about whether to invest in the Monterey, what would you be looking at? What are the kind of indicators that you'd be focused
Well, I think,
on?
I'm not I have made a lot of investments, but I'm definitely not an oil and gas expert. But from what I can tell, one of the big questions, of course, is how much it costs to bring it up. And when you look at those pictures of the strata, it's
Yep.
very complicated, and it looks to me as if it's going to be incredibly expensive to bring it up if it's there.
Yep, that's good.
So I look at it and I think, in terms of expensive oil to bring up, there are places in this world where there is expensive oil to bring up that for darn sure is there. Here it looks to me like something. I think that it's just incredible. I draw, some pretty strong conclusions from the fact that the Exxons of the world, I believe Chevron is a California oil company.
Yeah.
I believe they've been here for a long time. I think, they're probably reasonably good at that kind of engineering. And if they're not interested, that just seems to me to be, if you think about the implications of that, they're pretty big.
That's great, thank you. Tom brought up acidizing, and I just wanted to push on that for a minute, and Rob, maybe go to you, because you wrote a lot about this in our series. for those who haven't been following, which is probably most people who are not sitting in a little room like those of us who focus on this issue and obsessing about it, those who aren't following this debate closely may not know that fracking, as we usually use the term throughout the United States, and more recently horizontal drilling, so drilling down and then horizontally and fracking, is not the technology that may be most likely used in the Monterey Shale. Because of that seismic activity, a lot of the permits that you'll actually see online, because of SB4, we now can look at these permits online and see that that there's permits being pulled to acidize instead, acid injection, where acid is getting shot down and then melting those rocks and sort of trying to bring the oil out that way. Somebody, Uday, who's here, actually noted to me the other day that hydrofluoric acid, which is what they're using, is the same acid they use to melt the bodies in Breaking Bad. So just as a little cultural reference there. And my husband, who's a physicist, said, you know, that is not stuff you mess around with in the lab. When I told him it was that kind of acid, he was like, that stuff melts glass. You don't mess around with that stuff. So, Rob, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's germane to Tom's point. This is complex technology. I mean, we've been doing acidizing, but acidizing in this type of shale, this kind of process, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's true. For a while, up until mid-last year, the national debate over fracking was essentially just transported to California. And so everything was about fracking, fracking, fracking. As it turns out, the Monterey Shale may not be primarily fracked. It may be primarily acidized. According to reports from various oil companies, the use of hydrofluoric acid, both as matrix acidizing, which means pumping it down, and acid fracturing, which is essentially fracking with acid, pumps this acid down and essentially melts the rock to get out the oil. It's incredibly dangerous stuff, as Kate mentioned. It's considered by public health officials as, you know, possible, terrorism danger if it can be stolen. It's tremendously dangerous stuff. It is being trucked all around the state now and being used in oil fields. When I called up the Cal OSHA representative, who is the head of all oil field regulations in the state, he said point blank, there is no acidization in the state. He was simply mistaken. They don't know. This is the cutting edge, and the level of knowledge until very recently has been very low. So when you hear about fracking, also think about acidizing and well stimulation methods, which is now the umbrella term that is being used, includes these and others as well.
Well, and I put up this slide again because this is a slide that was made using GIS with the SB4 data now online for all of the current permits being pulled since January 2014. Those little green parts are acid wells. So the yellow is new horizontal drilling, and the green is acid. Tom, we're losing Tom, so thank you to Tom. And we're going to keep going, and I'm actually going to open it up to questions from you all, because I'm sure you have some. Sorry, it's the National Green Schools Network Conference today, just 2 blocks away at the Convention Center, and he's keynoting over there. So it's one of those days.
Hey, Bob Mulholland, so what do you guys think is the potential for oil out of the Monterey?
Do you want to take that, Dave?
I think I said there certainly will be more oil that's coming out of the Monterey. I expect, out of back-end analogs, probably very little. There will be a lot of, secondary recovery around existing fields in the Monterey, like the diatomite, so they'll apply, maybe more cyclic steam, CO2 injection to try to recover more oil. So I expect quite a lot of oil will come out that way. So there probably is, 1 or 2 billion barrels of oil to come out.
Over 20 years?
Yeah, over time. I mean, Rob mentioned they're producing about 500,000 barrels per day in California right now, so that's 1 billion barrels, say, over 7 or 8 years. And there's a lot of other places other than the San Joaquin Basin that produce oil. So California is not going to stop producing oil anytime soon.
We are, if you look at this again, those red and orange dots are existing wells. So you see there is drilling going on in the Monterey. I mean, it's not new to drill in the Monterey. It's new to try to get down into this lower subsurface rock that we've been talking about. It's not new to do the surface level, the stuff that's gone up. But we are losing, production is going down in the state about 2% a year right now. So we are kind of constantly vying with Alaska for the number 3 or number 4 slot in the United States for oil producing state. And that vying is because both our and Alaska production are going down. Right now, theirs is going down a little faster.
I went to an oil industry conference in Bakersfield last year, and it was full. The room was full. There's a lot of oil industry folks. There's still hope. And, you know, they're smart people. They've been at it. They work hard. They'll continue getting oil out of the state. Whether they can arrest the decline a little bit is an open question. But as Dave said, oil is not going away, but the visions of a historic epic boom raining manna from the skies is probably a bit overestimated.
Saudi America. I don't know if you've heard that, but that's what people call it.